So for those of you who were here yesterday, I talked about the that when my group attempted to reproduce superconductivity in twisted bilayer graphene, the first time that we tried it, we got something, we didn't see superconductivity and saw something different that I think ultimately was maybe even more interesting. The first orbital magnet at or near zero magnetic field, that is a magnet that worked the way that that we were told in our first physics classes, that there was just a little loop of current and lots of little loops of current that were oriented that together add up to a big loop of current. And so instead of the magnet being made primarily out of spins, it was actually made out of circulating currents. And just to be clear, since then we have seen superconductivity in twisted bilayer graphene a number of times. The difference was because we had inadvertently done something different in our stacking. Specifically, we had aligned the twisted bilayer graphene nearly perfectly to one of the two layers of hexagonal boron nitride that was protecting it. And so instead of the boron nitride acting as something really inert, it was playing a role in shaping the state of the system, changing the band structure. So so that's where we left it last time, and I told you that today would be about another attempt to reproduce now the orbital magnet. So just as a reminder, there was superconductivity and correlated insulators, I just 1 second. I attempted to hide slides, but I seem to get the wrong one. So let's try this again. All right. Well, I won't go backward. We saw orbital magnetism as heralded by a very strong Hall effect around zero field that was hysteretic, and as of today, this is known to exist in 2 samples in the world. And
hi, David. Hi,
yes.
David. Yeah, we see a blackout. We have a blackout, so I don't know
Right.
what appears.
Thank you.
Now it's okay. So apparently there was one slide is not. We didn't see the last slide, but
all right. So I'm not sure why that was. I'm now seeing it as blackout. Also, can you?
No, we cannot see that. Perhaps you want to skip, but the next one. Oh no.
You can't see it?
No, actually, we don't see anything now.
All right, let's stop the share. I will.
Okay.
So I will try to multitask for, well, no, actually, I'm not going to try to. All right, here's what I'm going to do. See if this. I'm sorry for
no problem.
the challenges. I think that I can. All right. I suspect that this will do it. Right. All right. Let's maybe this will be the charm. So can you see it now?
No,
Oh,
we see
no.
you. We see you.
Yes, you see me, but yes, this time it will work. And all right.
Yeah, now it seems to work.
All right. Yes. So, so the modern world sometimes comes together. Thanks very much, Santiago, and everyone for your patience. And let me just repeat from yesterday that if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask while we're going along. So as I said yesterday, all these samples with their beautiful, exquisite physics are made still using a relatively old-fashioned, and I would call artisanal technique. It's done, one at a time by students, and that involves taking the best single crystals you can find of some layered material, in this case graphite, putting a simple piece of Scotch tape. If you look at it, this is Scotch magic tape. That's actually the version that Gaiman Novoselov used originally, and it actually is still one of the best to use. Peeling off, folding it over a few times, sticking it down on a simple substrate, peeling it off, and seeing what you get. And when it works well, sometimes you get some very thin layers, including, in this case, 1 layer, 2 layer, 3 layers, 4 layers of graphene. And if you want to look at monolayer, for example, which is used to make twisted bilayer, then you would just focus on this part and continue your fabrication and etch away the rest. So, then you use a little piece of polymer that's a bit rubbery and sticky, a layer of different polymers to pick up part of this monolayer, then rotate, pick up another part of the monolayer, and you have your 2 layers of graphene. And I've skipped the other layers involving boron nitride, but you get the idea. The issue with this is that you're stuck with whatever flakes you find. And secondly, the specific method for making this twisted layer, at least that most people still use, is called tear and stack. Picking up part of it and abruptly pulling off the surface to rip it, and then moving over another part and rotating. And you can imagine that that's not going to give you totally reproducible results. It has the advantage that you can hope to define the angle between one part and another, because you know that this is a single crystal of monolayer. And so when you align part of it to another part, but with a rotation between the two, you can hope to set the angle between them. But you can see that it's not going to be totally reproducible, and indeed, we don't always get the same angle. And so this I showed you this before. This is a stacking station that my student Aaron Sharp built after visiting Pablo Herrero's lab. This field is very generous about sharing knowledge and helping people out. And you can see it's nicely built, but it's basically mostly a set of micrometers that you can carefully adjust to position things in many axes. And then there are two critical axes, one the rotation and one the approach between 2 parts that are motorized, and so we can control them really finely. In any case, I mentioned that this leads to every sample is different. So now I'm going to tell you about the next different sample. This is just trying to, yeah, there we go. So this was an attempt to make two twisted layers aligned with boron nitride. In this case, we got a twist angle between the two layers that was a bit larger than we wanted, not 1.2 degrees, but nearly 1.4 degrees. And that's, you might think, all right, that's not a very big difference, but actually in the world of magic angle graphene, where even 1/100th of a degree can matter, this is a big difference. And specifically at this angle, you wouldn't expect a very flat band. The band now has enough dispersion that Coulomb energies are not going to dominate over the bandwidth. So when you look at sweeping the filling of the band from completely empty to completely full through the charge neutrality point, you can see that at the charge neutrality point, the resistivity is a sort of familiar 2 kiloohms. It's not 100 kiloohms. There's no gap opened here. And in addition, there aren't strong features at, say, half filling of the electron part of the conduction part of the band, or half filling of the whole part of the band. So all of this looks like, all right, we just got the wrong angle, and this is going to be a relatively, it's not going to show the magnetism because it's not a very flat band, but it's going to be pretty mundane. But now we can turn on a magnetic field. And here's what happens when we turn on a relatively modest magnetic field, 1/10 of a Tesla all the way up through 2 Tesla. Now, first I should mention that this is a resistivity, a longitudinal resistivity, so a measure of the scattering in the sample, not the Hall resistance. And secondly, this is on a log scale. So if you look at this, there's a lot going on, and I'll pick that apart. But the most dramatic thing that's happening is roughly around half filling of the electron band or the whole band. There's a huge magnetoresistance. So in the end, we've seen up to about a factor of 300 in some cases. And that's very unusual to see a really large magnetoresistance. And when it occurs, usually the context it occurs in is a very simple one in a sense. Some of you probably learned solid state physics from Ashcroft and Merman's book, and they go through the calculation of what happens if you have two populations of carriers, one electrons and one holes, and they have almost the same density, just opposite polarity. And what is the Hall effect and what is the longitudinal resistance? And that's a case where you get a very large magnetoresistance, but that involves having two densities that are almost perfectly matched and opposite. Here we're getting this large magnetoresistance. So that occurs, say, in a semi-metal, a slightly compensated semi-metal. Here we have this very large magnetoresistance over a large range of density. And so there's no way that we can stay at the same density everywhere there. So that was the first thing that really jumped out for us. If we look in these regions, here's a cut where we're sweeping magnetic field, and you can see this very large magnetoresistance. It's actually approximately quadratic, and that's the same that you see in a compensated semi-metal. And then you start to see oscillations that look like Shobnikov-de Haas oscillations, so the formation of Lando levels. And if we look closer, we get our second surprise, that the Lando levels seem to appear in pairs. that I'm not showing this in terms of filling factor, but if I did, this would be an integer filling factor, and we'd have features split to above and below that integer filling factor. So that's again very unusual and surprising. And so let's put together these different ways of looking at the data in a color map. So last time I showed you a color map and then broke it down and did line cuts from it. In this case, the line cuts that I showed you were first line cuts along the gate voltage axis, changing density at different magnetic fields. And you can see this is the region where magnetoresistance occurs, where there's a very large color change from zero magnetic field to even a very small magnetic field. And then the other line cut that I showed you was a line cut at fixed density, but sweeping the magnetic field. And when we put these together, what you can see is that these Lando levels, which I can now make assignments, these are what you would expect to be the dominant Lando levels are, say 4, 8, 12. This comes from the fact that that you have spin and rough spin and valley symmetry in the system. So every Lando level is in a multiple of 4, and then it's familiar that you can get that symmetry weakly broken, and so you also get say 2, and then a little more subtly 1 and 3. So all of that looks reasonable, but then when you start to see what happens when these Lando levels enter the region with strong magnetoresistance, you can see that they seem to split in 2, and it occurs on both the hole side and the electron side. And that's really strange, and no one had reported that before. And there's one other strange thing that sort of jumps out here.
David,
yes,
there is actually a small question. Yes, is the magnetic field perpendicular or parallel to the sample?
Yes, I apologize. I should have said this field is perpendicular to the sample, and I'll say one thing very near the end about parallel fields, but thank you very much, Danielle. So for those of you who are used to looking at diagrams that are sort of like this, first of all, I referred to Lando levels, and those are things that occur when you have a magnetic field perpendicular to a 2D sheet. But also there's more richness than just electrons in 2D in this system. It's electrons in 2D, but with it's not a Jellium model. It's not electrons that are just unpatterned, but they're living in a periodic potential, a spatially periodic potential. Now that's true of all electrons in materials. After all, we have crystal lattices, but in twisted bilayer graphene, as you may remember from last time, we form a Moires structure. The two lattices, because you have two lattices that would be matched if there was no rotation angle, but because of the small twist, the two go in and out of registry. They beat against each other, just like if you play two musical notes when an orchestra is tuning up, you play two musical notes and they're slightly out of tune with each other, then over time they go in and out of registry, and the frequency of that so-called beat note tells you how much out of tune the two notes are. Similarly, the smaller the twist angle, the more slowly in space these two lattices go in and out of registry. And for the angles that we're considering, the spatial period of this, at magic angle, it's around 10 nanometers. Here it's a little bit less than 10 nanometers, but we get this pretty large spatial period lattice and then we're putting on a magnetic field that can actually thread substantial flux through each plaquette of this lattice, through each copy, each unit cell effectively of the lattice, so that at the maximum magnetic field we're able to apply, it's maybe a third of a it's around a third of a flux quantum per site. And some of you may know that what I've just described is the Hofstetter problem. Douglas Hofstetter, who, when he was doing his PhD physics thesis, considered this problem of a periodic lattice and a magnetic field normal to the plane, and found that you get all kinds of not just the regular Lando levels, but all kinds of lines that cross each other. But what they don't do is split. They don't. There's no. Well, his calculation didn't calculate resistance, but they wouldn't produce a strong magnetoresistance. And if you look more closely, when these splitting lines cross each other, there's an ornate structure where this line comes, it jumps as it crosses the other line, and then it jumps back when it crosses the second one. So there's all this ornate structure. So let's try to understand what's going on here. I told you that so we have these three sets of phenomenology, and I told you that the model that one might imagine for this is something that looks like a periodic potential with a magnetic field on it, but that does not give this exotic behavior. And so if we can maybe get a clue by looking at what's happening to the Hall effect as we tune gate voltage. So near the charge neutrality point, the Hall effect gives you can extract a density that just goes linearly with gate voltage. That's what you expect normally. Then in these regions where we get the strong magnetoresistance, what we see is a Van Hove singularity. We cross over from electron-like behavior to hole-like behavior. And if you remember last time, that was something that occurred at 3 electrons per Moire cell. Here it's occurring around and close to 2 electrons per Moire cell, although I'm giving density not in electrons per Moire here, but in 10 to the 12 per centimeter squared. And when we go through the Van Hove singularity, we've gotten a jump in density, but now it keeps going up. So what you see is that this region is indeed, as we sort of thought it might be, a region that's pretty near a compensated situation, or the region that's shaded is the region where we're crossing over from electrons to holes. So, so that's maybe matching what we thought might give magnetoresistance, though still not why it's over this large range. Another thing I'll mention is that if you heard Pablo Herrero's talks last week, you would have had a much more jumpy behavior in the Hall signal. Every time you get to 1 electron per Moire, 2 per Moire, 3 per Moire, there would be discontinuities here where the system would polarize and form, in some cases, an insulating state. But in any case, here there's no, it wouldn't be fully visible in the Hall signal, but I can say there's no evidence of polarization. And again, that's not surprising here. This band is broader than the Coulomb energy, and so it's not too surprising that the Hall signal does something relatively simple. So, but we've learned something on this. Strong magnetoresistance is occurring near Van Hove singularities. So now it's time for me to show you the sample, and you can see that this is a somewhat more complex and rich sample than the ones that we started with. We've learned how to make it big enough that we can actually put 20 electrical leads on and thereby probe different parts of the sample. And we've built electronics that allow us to do all of this simultaneously. So we can measure longitudinal resistance on 8 pairs here, 8 more pairs there, so 16, and then also 9 Hall pairs, 25 of them. We can measure all of those simultaneously so that when we sweep the magnetic field and gate voltage just once, we can collect information about all these different parts of the sample. And that's really useful because it turns out the sample is not homogeneous. And this is common in twisted bilayer graphene. So what you can see is we can extract electrically information about the twist angle, and you see that the twist angle is not constant, but actually varies over the sample. So if we go through all but the very outer contact pairs, you can see that there's a variation of about 1/10 of a degree in twist angle. And if we look at the magneto resistance is very different in the different, it appears in all these contact pairs, but it's different in the different pairs. And it seems that it's probably peaked around a particular angle. I'm just showing you on the sample that there's yet another surprise. One small region of the sample shows superconductivity, which had never been reported this far from the magic angle. So its superconductivity had been reported up to about 1.2 degrees in twisted bilayer graphene with boron nitride, but not at close to 1.4 degrees. So there are a lot of things that are strange here, and I'll have to say, I have nothing to say at this point about the superconductivity, except that there are more mysteries lurking. But I can say something about the rest at long last. So we had identified these crossings and tried to describe them phenomenologically, and then and we had been bringing these sorts of data to every theorist we could talk to, and they all said, "Wow, beautiful! I've never seen anything like this before." We also brought them to experimentalists, but I have no idea what's going on. And so my student, Joe Finney, who is quite resourceful, said, you know, while I'm puzzling over this, let me just, for play, let me calculate the Hofstetter model. So magnetic field threaded through a periodic potential where you have hopping in two perpendicular directions, and the magnetic field adds phases to these hoppings. And so this is something that's been calculated countless times, but just as a toy project, decided to do calculations on this and to see what would come out, and could he maybe tweak it and see some of these behaviors. So let me say what the behaviors are. I told you that there's this really ornate crossing that each of the split levels has a jump as it crosses the other. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Hofstetter. This is called the Hofstetter butterfly. This is energy on the vertical axis, and magnetic field on the vertical axis, energy on the horizontal axis, and actually, let me think. No, magnetic field is horizontal here. So you can see that energies start to split as you go out in magnetic field. In any case, this beautiful fractal structure isn't what we measure. We measure not in energy space, but in density. So I'll step you through how this works. But in any case, the Hamiltonian here is very simple. It's just hopping to nearest neighbors. And I'll skip ahead. Joe played with some of the simplest adjustments he could make to this. He could say, all right, the hopping in the in one direction is different strength from the hopping in the other direction. And he also said, let's add next nearest neighbor hopping, which effectively doubles the unit cell. And these were two of the first few tweaks he started putting in and calculating this. And here's what it produces. So I'm now showing things both in magnetic field and energy space, which is where here is the energy of the charge. No, I guess the charge neutrality point is at one end here. So this is an energy space and flux. And here Joe mapped this to density that we can tune with the gate electrode here from the charge neutrality point to full filling. And here's around half filling, and you see something's going on here. And remarkably, with these simple tweaks to the model, anisotropy and next nearest neighbor hopping, you get things that look a lot like what Joe is seeing in his experiments. You see these splittings of Lando levels as they go into a certain region around half filling. When the Lando levels cross, there's an ornate structure that actually, maybe I'll show you a zoom in, but that shows exactly the kind of behavior I described. And so this was sort of miraculous that it was, without any understanding of why we would get this model. And in fact, now is probably a good time to mention that this model is on a square lattice, but the actual sample should have six-fold symmetry. So it's not even the right, it's not just oversimplified, it's the wrong symmetry for it. So it was really remarkable that these all jumped out together, and there didn't need to be fine tuning. When we finally shared this further with the world by posting on arXiv, we got two good things that came out of it. One was Daniel Parker, who's a theorist at Harvard, pointed out that instead of next nearest neighbor hopping, we could simply say that there are two populations of fermions living on this lattice, and they have a different energy, different by some factor V. So that's a little bit simpler physical interpretation, and it gives the same behavior. And the other good thing I'll mention shortly. So in any case, we now refine the model. So we have anisotropy and two fermion species with an energetic splitting, and we get this nice match to the data without real fine tuning of the parameters. And I should mention that actually, if we look more carefully, it really seems that the splitting between the two species, it's a better description to say that it rises with magnetic fields, maybe like a Zeeman energy, so that maybe these are two spins, or maybe they're two orbital states. So here I'm just going back and forth between constant and Zeeman, and if you stare at it, you can see it actually, the Zeeman-like term gives a better description. But this was not very obvious. But if instead of going to a third of a flux quantum per Moires cell, what if we could go to double that? Then the Zeeman splitting and the constant model look quite dramatically different. And so actually, in just a couple of days, Joe and one of my other students, Lindsay Rodenbach, are going to the National High Magnetic Field Lab in the US to open up this second part of the picture. In this case, to go to 30 Tesla, not 45, but they'll be able to answer that question. So I'm just going to skip over. And let me do the, yes, there's
There is
another question. There's another
more
question. Yes. So, so this is now on the honeycomb. So Nicholas, good and natural question. No, we have calculated on various other lattices, the hexagonal lattice and others, but it turns out that the honeycomb lattice is not the right model for this either. It turns out that the twisted bilayer cannot be represented in tight binding. There's what Senthil described as a there's a topological aspect to the structure that says what you get out of the continuum model that McDonald and Bistritzer wrote down and described a decade ago is not actually describable in a tight binding model. So that was actually the start of why Joe used this simpler model. It was because it's actually quite challenging to do the continuum model, and in particular, as far as we know, it's particularly difficult to add the sort of adjustments that Joe added to the continuum model. So he decided to play with a model that he could actually, on his own laptop with a GPU, could do reasonably efficient calculations. So he was looking under the street lamp, doing the things that were easy. So why can we get something that's about right, even though we're not even on the right lattice? So first of all, the anisotropy that's introduced means that we're breaking rotational symmetry. So we only we don't have the original lattice's rotational symmetry anyway. And once you're breaking rotational symmetry down to C2, it doesn't really matter whether you're doing that starting with something with 6-fold symmetry or 4-fold. So that's lucky. And I think it's telling us that actually these behaviors are much more generic. It means that we shouldn't take very seriously the specific parameter values that we used, but anyway, those didn't need to be fine-tuned to produce these behaviors. You can fine-tune them, and actually we had a high school student working with us over the summer who really looked at what exact parameter values do you need to describe this, and I hope we'll have more to say about that in the near future about how things vary as we go across the sample. But I think what this is telling you that we use the wrong model and still get this behavior. It tells us it's rather generic. So I'm going to do the acknowledgements and then say a little bit about what we think might be happening and where to go from here. So as with the work before, my students Aaron Sharp and Eli Fox were quite involved, but this was led by Joe Finney. And this is the paper on archive that this is based on, that my talk is based on. So let me now just, right, I think I'm going to just stay here and make a couple of comments about what may be happening. If you remember, this sample was made by the tear and stack technique. And if you imagine taking a very thin membrane, say a plastic wrap, and tearing it, you might imagine that you would introduce strain. And so remember, there's what Joe needed to put into the model is anisotropy, different tunneling in one direction versus the other. We believe that that's coming from uniaxial strain. But we don't know that concretely, and so we want to study that more. Secondly, just as with the magnetic case, when we put this work out into the world, an experimentalist said, hey, I think that this looks familiar. And with the magnet, it was Andrea Young's group going back and studying a sample that had aligned boron nitride, but in this case, was Matt Yankowitz saying, from my postdoc in Columbia with Corey Dean and others, I think I've seen something with sort of this kind of magneto resistance, and indeed, the number of, in that moment, the number of known samples in the world that had this property doubled. I'm pleased to say that just in the last week, in an attempt to reproduce this, finally, the third time, we've actually, instead of finding something new, we actually have been able to find another sample that has all of the hallmarks of this. So we're going to the National High Magnetic Field Lab with 2 rather than 1 sample. So just to summarize, we think that what's going on is uniaxial strain. That's not something that is generally controlled in stacking right now, but it's something that I hope we'll be able to get more control over. And it's just showing how many surprises may lurk, just next to what everyone's been focusing on. And so I consider this extremely hopeful, but it also means that there's an imperative to try to be able to make samples in a more controlled way. And there are many steps that people are taking along these lines. There's work at Brookhaven National Lab that was launched by Amir Yacobi that's aiming to replace students with robots. And that's, in this case, a good thing. In the end, students and other physicists will be studying the resulting stacks, but they're trying to systematize the making of each part of the stack, but they're still going to be exfoliating from bulk crystals, and we'll get randomness there. And so so I think that's going to be very impactful in the coming years. But my colleague, Andy Mannix, and I are going to try something that's a somewhat bolder jump that's based on his work as a postdoc with Ji-Woong Park at Chicago. And that's trying to do stacking based not on exfoliated flakes, but based on large area CVD grown flakes, like we're used to, CVD grown films, like what we're used to doing in the semiconductor world, and doing stacking in an automated way in vacuum based on those. And our stacking system is in progress. It should be completed in the next month or so. And so I hope that next time I meet some of you, I'll be able to say, now we're able to make 100 basically identical samples, or 100 samples where all we changed was the twist angle, but we really carefully controlled the conditions for everything else. So that's what I think will be what I think and hope will be the path ahead. And I have no doubt that even if we stop having our fallible students doing the peeling, I am sure that we will continue to stumble on surprises in what we thought was a well-explored neighborhood. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for this talk. I see no questions here in the Q&A box. I see no questions in the Slack channel.
Yeah, I think that.
Yeah.
Yeah. If there are no questions, maybe I have one. So it's a very general question. I don't know, do you have any insight or you mentioned that you are also working on ways to have more control on the alignment between the layers. Do you have some idea of which techniques are available in order to determine the crystal orientation for nitride?
So Reyes was asking, I guess there are two questions implicit there. One is, how do you control the alignment very precisely, and the other might be, what targets would you be shooting for, or can you specify which you most want to know?
No, the second. Well, no, I think it was all the same question, because I think to determine the alignment, to some extent, you need to know the crystal orientation of your flakes.
Yes, so as long as you're trying to align on one material to the same material, the brilliance of what Pablo's group came up with, and separately Emmanuel Tutik's group came up with, this tear and stack technique, is that you don't need to know the crystal orientation of that layer. You just need to put together two parts of the same layer. And so as long as you're just working within one material, that's fine. But it's not okay when you're going from, you're trying to align graphene to boron nitride. There, I told you last time, there are lots of pitfalls because you have to go by facets, and those facets are, you can't tell to better than a degree or so. And you could be off by 30 degrees because it could be the wrong facet. So you're right that there are ways to ascertain this. So first of all, you could try to do crystallography. You could do diffraction and determine the orientation of each of the crystals independently. And we do plan to do that in our next generation UHV system. We plan to have those sorts of tools. But you can also use more some commonly available tools. So probably many people in this room are familiar with Raman spectroscopy, which tells you about the vibrations of a crystal that light can couple to inelastically. And it turns out that Raman is sensitive to twist angle between two layers. And so you can learn something about that, although it gets awfully complicated if you have boron nitride, graphene, and graphene. But if you have just two of them, there's a literature on what you should see in Raman, and it's somewhat informative. You can use second harmonic generation. That gives you some information, especially in things like boron nitride or transition metal dichalcogenides. So there are some tools that you can use, and that can save you from having to cool down many samples to find what you're looking for. Instead, you can check, do you have the structural motifs that you're looking for? But it's really tricky because in the fabrication process, you can get twist changes. The system really, really wants to be aligned. It doesn't want to be at a small twist. And locally, it will realign. If you have a twist angle that is a degree or so or smaller, so right at the magic angle or smaller, you get substantial local relaxation, realignment of the lattices so that they're locally aligned, but they're still stuck globally. But a significant fraction of the time, you'll actually see a global realignment, that the one flake will macroscopically rotate to lock in with the other. And so you really need to do your characterization as much as possible on the actual sample you're working with, and even in the device structure, and that gets challenging. So I think that there are no magic bullets, but I do think that there are some tools that you can use to give yourself a better chance and to know whether you've succeeded. So that's, yeah. I just want to say one more thing. I know it's the end of this, but remember this first thing that jumped out for us, the magneto resistance. I showed you that there was something that seemed to correlate to that in the inverse density of states that I was plotting for the Hofstetter structure with these extra terms. But I have to say the Hofstetter structure is just a spectrum. It's not a calculation of conductance or scattering. And we still don't fully understand. We've been planning to do a Kubo formula calculation to try to see, can we get this strong magneto resistance from that model? But I would say that's at the moment open and out there. And so if there's anyone who's excited for a small toy calculation that might reveal something, I think it would be really interesting to understand why we actually see this strong magneto resistance over a large range of density.
Okay, thank you. There is actually a question now in the Q&A box.
Okay, great. Yep, I can. Yeah. So the Hofstetter model you used, this is from Mikkel Garcia. Thank you, Mikkel. Welcome back. Mikkel asked a couple of good questions last time. The Hofstetter model you used is just a single square or triangular lattice. That's right, that's what it starts with, but then we add anisotropy. So on the square lattice, that's easy to think about. Its hopping is different in one direction from the other. So I'll just go back to so we add anisotropy, hopping different in one direction than the other. On a triangular lattice, you can do this by making one of the three directions different from the others. And then we also add a splitting in energy between two species of electrons, which right now we don't know. It could be two spins, it could be two orbital states. And so maybe just as a so yes, Mikhail, this model started life as just a simple square or triangular lattice, but we added on, Joe added on a couple of small components to that. And maybe this is a nice way to complete the circle. There was a question earlier about whether that was from Danielle about was our magnetic field perpendicular or in the plane? And so all of these things are changing the hopping, the phases of the hopping, so it needs a perpendicular field. But now that we see this splitting between two species, you can ask, is that spins? So Nicholas asked, this is now in the honeycomb. Oh, sorry, that was old. I apologize. We have this splitting between two spins or two orbital states, we don't know. And so to look at that, we might want to see what is the effect of an in-plane field. And we did just a very quick measurement before going to the magnet lab, putting the biggest in-plane field we were able to in that cryostat, which was 4 Tesla. And the effect of the in-plane field, a perfectly in-plane field, was nothing. So we do want to combine those and ask what happens if you have an out-of-plane field, but you also add a big in-plane field. So if what you're splitting is spins, they should be split more. That's something that we hope to do in future, but the jury is out about whether the objects that we're splitting are orbit spins or something else.
Thank you, David. I actually have one question.
Great.
Related with the beginning of your talk. You showed a plot the magnetoresistance versus the film, and close to the charge neutrality point, there were some wiggles, and they look symmetric at that one. Yeah, does exactly. Those wiggles are merely noise, or do they have any meaning?
Oh, no. So an excellent question, Santiago. So those are actually Shubnikov-de Haas oscillations, which we're seeing here. So these are the successive filling and emptying of Lando levels, and we're seeing it here as a function of carrier density.
Okay.
You can see that they shift a little bit with magnetic field, and if we look at this plot, you can see they're just cuts through these Lando levels,
okay.
but we're doing a cut in this direction.
Okay.
So,
yeah, perfect. Thank you, David. I see no more questions in the Q&A box, and yeah, so on behalf of everyone, I thank you again, David, for these talks, for being with us in this topological summer school, and of course, you are kindly invited to come here in person next year.
Yes, I wish that this had been in person rather than virtual, and may we soon be in a situation where that's safe and we can rejoice in talking together over beer.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you again, and we see you soon. So we close the session.